Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed, and this is our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism. Today, we are honored to welcome David Hirsh from the London Center on Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Welcome, David.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you for joining us. Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
So my name is David Hirsh. I am a senior lecturer at Goldsmiths, which is a college of the University of London. I teach sociology, and my intellectual interest really focuses on anti-Semitism, other things too, on democracy and totalitarianism. And I am the academic director of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, which we have set up fairly recently, about a year and a half ago, in order to institutionalize and strengthen our scholarship on contemporary anti-Semitism and to forge networks of anti-Semitism scholars around the world, and to try to strengthen the community of scholarship and the infrastructure of scholarship for people interested in anti-Semitism.
We are honored to have you today, David. I ask this question because I believe that on whatever you work, you require a definition. Even when you work on manufacturing a car, for example, you need to define what you are working with. Now, I have interviewed some speakers who had struggled in even saying the definition itself of anti-Semitism. Some organizations, let me be very brutally honest here, UN-related organizations, they just do not want to say the definition, or they do not have a working definition. My question has two parts. One is why it is difficult for certain organizations to define anti-Semitism, and the second part is what is the definition of anti-Semitism?
Okay, great question, because very often everybody starts by defining what they're talking about. I'm one of the people who will find that a little bit difficult. And you asked me why it's difficult, and I think perhaps there are two reasons that I can think of. One is that actually, like pretty well any other social phenomenon, anti-Semitism requires a lot of judgment. So, it's not like a science where there's one variable, there are any number of variables. And what that means is that we have to use our judgment about what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. I also think the other reason probably why it's so difficult to define anti-Semitism is because the community of people within which we are trying to define anti-Semitism is also a community of people in which anti-Semitism is quite well entrenched. Now, that's quite unusual. So, for example, if we were trying to define racism or anti-Black racism amongst scholars, we would all start with a very clear kind of consensus, really, about what was racist and what wasn't. And of course, we'll have disagreements within that. And of course, some of the people who say that they're very vigilant on racism may not actually be quite as vigilant as they think. But we start anyway with a feeling of consensus. And we don't start in that way with anti-Semitism. We start with a polarization, actually. And the polarization is quite frightening. So that's why there is such a polarized discussion about definitions. Let me just say a word about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Having said, I think it's really difficult to define anti-Semitism, I would also like to say that I strongly support the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And that's not because I think that the IRA definition is a kind of watertight machine that can tell us what is and what is not anti-Semitic. I don't think it is, and I don't think such a thing is possible. There's no app for your iPhone that you can just point it at something and say, is this anti-Semitic? I think IRA is really important because I think anyone who embraces IRA or who endorses the definition is saying one thing very clearly. And what they're saying is that the kind of anti-Semitism that takes the form of hostility to Israel, we might call it anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. If you embrace IRA, I think what you're saying is that you take anti-Zionist anti-Semitism seriously. You believe that it exists and it is significant. And you also believe that it often appears like this, and this, right? It gives you examples of how anti-Zionist anti-Semitism appears. But it gives you a couple of warnings too, the IRA definition. Firstly, it says you have to make every determination of a particular case in context. So, in fact, the IRA definition doesn't define anything to be anti-Semitic. What it says is that this kind of anti-Semitism is real and significant, and it looks like this, but you have to make a determination about anything specific according to context. And secondly, the IRA definition is also very clear when it says criticism of Israel, which is like the criticism of any other state, is not anti-Semitic. So I think IRA is useful because it makes clear that we see this kind of anti-Semitism and we take it seriously. I think it's actually a very tame document because it doesn't define anything as being anti-Semitic. It says you have to make a judgment according to context. And it also warns you very clearly that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. So in that context, it is a mystery, if you think about it like that. It's a complete mystery about why it is so controversial and why people are so worried about the IRA definition. And I think the reason people are so worried goes back to the polarization that I spoke about a minute ago. And I think the standard response to someone who raises the issue of contemporary anti-Semitism, who says they have experienced it, or who says that they would like to understand it or to study it or to write about it, the standard response is a kind of knowing, kind of, we know what you're up to, right? You say you're interested in anti-Semitism, but we know what you're really up to. And we're not going to accuse you of having got it wrong or make a misjudgment, but we're going to accuse you of getting it wrong deliberately. And that is the standard response that we get. Not that, you're a bit paranoid or you're a bit over worried about anti-Semitism, and I understand why. It's not that. It is you are raising the issue of anti-Semitism in bad faith, knowing it's not true, in the hope of silencing or delegitimizing ordinary criticism of the Israeli state.
That's a very elaborated definition. Or also, it's important to explain what surrounds the definition. And yes, indeed, it's about the judgment. I mean, I know our discussion today is not about online or social media, etc. But I think I wanted to bring something very troubling. I have been following something that started emerging on YouTube, which is a Yemeni guy dressing like Jewish, pretending to surround the Arab leaders around him, and that he is Israel and he is in control of the Arab world and he leads them. It's a very terrifying image to see, and it's definitely anti-Semitism. But the problem is that YouTube doesn't take it down. Anyway, so I think I wanted to mention this because it's a very recent. It's like it happened yesterday, and people started circulating it on social media and also via WhatsApp. I am from Mosul, and I started getting from people in Mosul sending me these messages with the video. Watch it before it gets deleted. So it's a very, I think the higher definition, having not said what is anti-Semitism, but it told you that once you understand the definition, you will know, and there is no other option that you don't know that this is anti-Semitism. It leads me to the question, David, is that such anti-Semitism has found a fertile environment in what is supposed to be the space that provides us with the educated people who should contribute to our daily life, our daily needs, and that is the university. What is the current state, specifically among students' organizations being functional on campus? They do help students, etc., establish a relation between faculty and the students, but they have been involved in another terrifying level of anti-Semitism in the past, in the very recent past, but also currently. So what's the current state of that?
Well, firstly, let's not be too surprised either if we come across anti-Semitism in universities or if we come across anti-Semitism in, broadly speaking, left and liberal politics. Let's not be too surprised, because anti-Semitism has been a serious phenomenon in both of those spaces before, and quite a number of times in history. That's not to say that anti-Semitism is not a problem in other spaces also, on the right or in religious thought or in other institutions. It is. But let's not pretend that universities or the liberal and left spaces are innocent, because they're not. One of the reasons for that is, so Moishe Postone is a brilliant Marxist. In fact, he died a few years ago. He was at Chicago University. And Moishe made the very important point that anti-Semitism tends to portray itself as the rebellion of the little guy, of the oppressed, against a kind of unseen, global and formidable power. Now, that's not to say that anti-Semitism is always or always has been a discourse of the powerless against the reputedly powerful, but it often has been. So we should not be surprised to find that universities, anti-hegemonic spaces are attracted to anti-Semitic thinking because they have been in the past, and also because, as Babel famously said in Germany in the 19th century, anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that he saw around him, he called it the socialism of fools. And what he meant by that was that instead of focusing on what he thought was rightly the enemy of the working class, which was, organized capital and the bourgeoisie, people mistakenly focused on Jewish capital or Jewish bankers or Jewish power, and they kind of mistook that for capital. And so they were a kind of socialist, but they were a kind of foolish socialism. Now, honestly, I kind of don't really want to accept that they were socialist at all. But on the other hand, there is a genuine socialist tradition of anti-Semitism. Again, not to say that socialism in itself has always been anti-Semitic. It certainly has not. But there is a tradition. So your question, is there anti-Semitism amongst student groups and on campus? And the answer is yes, there is. And we're not surprised by that because it's one of the places where we would expect to find it. And it has manifested, I was first involved in these discussions in the 1980s. And we were involved, I was in a Trotskyist group at that time, and we were involved in discussions on the far left. And we were defending Jews against people who said that the Jewish societies at universities are Zionist, and therefore they are racist, and therefore they are incompatible with the values of the student movement, and therefore they should be prohibited. So back in the 80s, we were already fighting people on the left who said that Jews should not be able to have an ordinary Jewish society in their university. To be honest, like that came out of the 1970s, the kind of United Nations, Zionism equals racism, a period when the Soviet Union had been working very hard to foster this idea that Zionism was a form of imperialism or apartheid, and it was anti-working class and against the oppressed, and it was anti-Soviet. Into the 70s, when this view was adopted by the UN, into the 80s, when, as I said, we were defending against attempts to ban Jewish societies. I think things calmed down a little bit in the period after that, with the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Palestinians, or the official leaders of the Palestinians, stopped saying that Israel was a unique evil that needed to be eradicated, and they started saying Israel is a problem to us, and it's been an enemy to us, and we want to make peace with it. We want to find a deal so that we can both live together, and we want to move forward side by side, which is quite a different view. People will know that fell apart in the end. I don't think it was inevitable, but it did fall apart in the end. And very quickly, at the beginning of the 21st century, this old 1970s Soviet ethic came back, which said Zionism is a radical and unique evil on the planet, and it needs to be eradicated, and anybody who supports it is like a supporter of imperialism or racism or Nazism.
Sorry, David, if I take you, sorry for interrupting you, but what you were saying is really very important, and we want to build on that to understand the current movement of anti-Semitism. I believe you have authored very important books on post October 7th. So how has, I mean, given your knowledge in the student organizations, in also you have been very active in defending Jewish societies on campus. How has this changed post October 7th? Mm-hmm. What did you see? What did you see that made you think that this time it's different?
Right. So the story was that I was going to tell was that in 2001, you had the end of the peace process, and you had the Durban World Conference Against Racism, which was a really formidable organized attempt to position Zionism back as the central form of racism on the planet after the defeat of apartheid. And you also had, a week later, 9/11. So that's 2001. By 2002 and 3, people started agitating to boycott Israeli universities. And that means that on our campus in London and your campuses in America, people wanted to exclude Israelis, people with a connection to Israel or Israeli institutions. And we fought those battles. And in Britain, that kind of politics was then embraced by the Labour Party itself and was quite close to number 10 Downing Street, to taking power in Britain. And that was defeated electorally, and the anti-Semitic politics really was pushed back onto campus after 2019. And then we had this event of October the 7th. And so what happened on October the 7th, people will know, I hope, is that Hamas organized an attack from Gaza on Israeli civilians living in the environment of Gaza. Something like 900 civilians were murdered. Another 200 or 300 Israelis were killed trying to defend those civilians and their communities. And there was a campaign of organized sexual violence also. And of kidnapping that I can't remember the figure, 200 or 300 Israelis were kidnapped and taken back to Gaza. Now, a lot of people, it's as though people didn't stop to catch their breath when they saw that happen. They didn't stop and say, that's quite big. And instead of doing that, many people just kind of seamlessly doubled down on their already existing intellectual framework. And they said, Israel is a unique evil in the world. Israel oppresses the Palestinians and is nothing else other than a machine for oppressing the Palestinians. And therefore, it's not, therefore we will see this as a kind of counter-hegemonic violence, as anti-Zionist or anti-imperialist violence. And there were, I think 4 ways in which people related to it immediately. One was by trivializing it. So they said, oh my gosh, yes, that's terrible, but. And the but was some version of, well, they deserved it, well, they had it coming, well, they lived in occupied land, well, that's what happens if you live in an oppressor state. So the first was trivialization, and also trivialization in relation to the violence that has come before and the violence that you predict will come soon from Israel. The second response was glorification, was hooray, hooray, this is brilliant, this is what the liberation will look like, this is the Palestinian Revolution, and people were very excitable. The third is simple denial. No civilians were killed deliberately. Nobody was raped. There was no organized rape. The kidnapping, well, that's legitimate. And again, this is a movement against imperialism and racism that we support. So trivialization, denial, glorification, and then denial. Yeah, it never happened. And then the last one was, yes, it did happen and it was terrible, but it was planned by the Israelis. It was a false flag operation. It was a conspiracy by Israel to give them a pretext to oppress the Palestinians. And lots of our colleagues on campus and lots of our students on campus embraced, I want to say, one of those 4 responses, but of course, lots of them embraced more than one of those responses at the same time, which you would think was a bit incoherent already. And then it emerged this narrative that the genocide was being committed by the state of Israel. So Hamas, which is a self-avowedly, explicitly genocidal organization against Jews, had killed as many Jews as it could find deliberately and explicitly and on camera and online. But the anti-Semites, as they often do, projected those fantasies and that crime onto the Jews. So the genocidal organization and the supporters of the genocidal organization said, no, this is not genocide, but it's the Israelis who are committing genocide, who have committed genocide, and who are now committing even worse genocide. And of course, that is exacerbated by the fact that the Israelis themselves are, many of them, descended from victims of genocide and victims of other kinds of ethnic cleansing. And it's exacerbated by the fact that it is not true. So what has been kind of disappeared from a lot of the discussion and coverage of the war between Israel and Hamas is that there is a war between Israel and Hamas. And there is still a war now between Israel and Hamas. Hamas still has weapons, it still has rockets, it still has supplies, it still has fuel, and it still has soldiers. And they are still fighting against the Israeli forces. I think over 250 Israeli people have died in the fight against Hamas. But the fight against Hamas has disappeared in the narrative because it's portrayed, only as an Israeli genocide, as an attempt to murder innocent civilians and specifically to murder children. And people will know that the allegation made against Jews that they murder innocent children for no reason at all and deliberately out of pure evil, that allegation goes back a very, very long way. I'm very proud to say that it originated in Britain in the 12th century, hooray. That allegation has always been some variant of blood libel, some variant of the allegation that Jews are evil because they reject God, they murdered God, and they reenact the murder of God against children. Now, of course, it's possible that, there might be Jews who are organizing the murder of children in some place, in some day and age, but that is not the case at the moment. And when people say that it is in fact a reflection of a very old and core anti-Semitic narrative. Now, it is completely normal and acceptable at the moment in public discourse and in academic discourse to accuse the Israelis of genocide and of child murdering. And therefore, it is completely normal and acceptable to push anti-Semitic discourse on campus and off campus.
If I want to take you, I think you have already answered many of my questions. But if we go deeper into the arguments, because David, you have seen this yourself. You mentioned this in your books, and you are talking about it now. The justification of October 7th attack across the globe is terrifying. Some use it through the post-colonial theory. Others justify it through the intersectionality of which the Jews are excluded. Others talk about it. This is, as you said, this is what liberation should look like. What did you expect? And nobody is talking about the genocidal intent of Hamas itself. And as you said, they have forgotten now October 7th, and nobody is talking about it anymore. Plus, they are saying, this is also a very old argument, saying that the Jews are imposing the narrative of anti-Semitism because they want to attack the others and to stop others from talking or to stop the freedom of expression. Thousands of arguments deeply rooted in academia. It's terrifying. It's not something that's happening in the media only. We are talking about a very important sector of our universe, which is academia. Can we go deeper into the arguments?
Right. So it takes us back to one of the first things I said in this discussion, was that anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism is accused of doing so in bad faith. So they're not accused of just being mistaken. I make a judgment that this is anti-Semitic and you make a judgment that it isn't. So what should happen? What should happen, of course, is that we then discuss. I give reasons and I give understandings and I give experiences, and we then discuss the nature of the reasons, the experiences and the evidence. But the disavowal of Jews, the assumption that Jews are raising this in bad faith, means that people don't have to do that work of discussion and looking at the evidence anymore. If I say I have experienced anti-Semitism and you say, Hirsh is a liar and he lies and we know why he lies, then you do not need to hear me anymore. You do not need to hear my experience or my evidence or my understanding. And so the effect of this mechanism, which I called the Livingston formulation, actually, after the one of the mayors of London, the effect of the Livingston formulation, the kind of immediate inverting of an allegation of anti-Semitism and the kind of response to an allegation of anti-Semitism with anti-Semitic conspiracy fantasy. We know what you're up to. You're just trying to silence criticism of Israel. The effect of that is to exclude Jews or to exclude anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism from the community of rational discourse. So you get excluded from the community of rational discourse. Why? Because you are excluded from the community of good people. And you are forcibly bundled over the borders of the community of the good, and you are treated as an enemy. So, for example, when we were fighting anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party, anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism is immediately defined as an opponent, as an enemy, as someone who doesn't support the British Labour Party. Of course, that wasn't true. We did support the British Labour Party, and that's why we wanted to oppose anti-Semitism within it, because we supported it. But the discourse was, you are Tories and Trumpists, and you are right-wingers and Zionists, and you therefore should not really be in the Labour Party. And therefore, we do not need to have a discussion with you. You are not part of the community of the party. You are not part of the community of rational discourse. And we don't have to talk to you. And then Jews who thought they were at home in the British Labour Party are no longer at home there. They are excluded, either, organizationally or just in fact. So this exclusion of Jews from a social space in which they thought they belonged is actually something that happens so often in anti-Semitism. I mean, you can think of Germany, that Jews were suddenly excluded from Germany, which was a place where they thought they were at home, to the Nazi willingness to exclude the Jews from the world, to things that seem a lot more trivial. For example, I'm in a sociology department at the University of London, but I'm treated by most of my sociology colleagues as though I'm not a real sociologist, because sociology really, they think, is to support the oppressed against the oppressors. And they think that what I do is a bad faith, dishonest putting to work of the complex ideas and structures of sociological discourse in order to subvert it and to do the opposite of what I'm supposed to do with it. So I suddenly was not treated as a fellow sociologist. Howard Jacobson was suddenly not a novelist, but a Zionist novelist. Luciana Berger was suddenly not a Labour MP, but a Zionist MP, the MP for Tel Aviv Central. And that's how Jews get excluded from communities in which they thought they belonged.
We have 3 minutes left, and I really want to talk more with you, but the time is limited. I mean, from what you say, it makes it look very difficult to combat it. But let me ask the question anyway. It's like, how do you really combat this? How do you stop it?
So I think it is very difficult to combat. I mean, look, there should be all kinds of organizational things that university administrators should do, but they are very, very hard to do because there is no consensus understanding that they are the right thing to do. So the really key thing that we need to do is to engage in all kinds of arguments about what is anti-Semitism, why people embrace it, why they stumble into it, why they double down when they have stumbled into it, and then why, when they find themselves in a conflict with Jews who don't like anti-Semitism, why they then decide that the Jews are their enemies. So what I'm saying is there are lots of things we can do organizationally, and we can fight back on Twitter and on Facebook and in social media and on campus. But the central thing we need to do is to engage in very high level discussion about some very important and profound ideas. And the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism aims to take those debates and those discussions and that evidence inside academia. We have hugely respected leaders of philosophy and social theory, people like Judith Butler, who believe that anti-Semitic movements like Hamas and Hezbollah are part of the global left and who accept that we must characterize the 7th of October as a counter-violence, as a response to imperialist oppression. We need to ask really difficult questions about why people who embrace those kinds of anti-Semitic frameworks are so admired and so powerful within sociology and philosophy and social theory, for example. And this is true over a very large number of academic disciplines. So what we want to try to do is to raise research funding so that people can sit and study and write books and write academic papers and engage with academic anti-Semitism. We want to renew the infrastructure and the communities of scholarship so that we can help people to get the books published and articles published, which becomes very difficult because peer review can be very conservative. If peer review is dominated by people who accept anti-Semitism as legitimate, then people who do not accept anti-Semitism as legitimate are going to have a hard time getting published in the right journals. And if you are not published in the right journals, you're not going to get research funding, and you're not going to get promotions, and you're not going to build your academic careers.
David, many thanks for your time and insights on a very concerning topic. This was,
Very much.
thank you. This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.